You chose to strike Earth. The council sat frozen in silence. The vote was already done when I walked into the chamber. I knew it before I crossed the threshold. I could feel it in the way the corridor fell silent as I passed 47 species represented in that building, and not one of them made a sound when the human walked through. That kind of silence does not happen by accident. It happens when people know something you are not supposed to know yet. My name is Kale Morrow. I am 34 years old. I grew up in a small town in northern England where it rained 9 months out of 12, and my grandmother made tea strong enough to stand a spoon in, and I spent my childhood reading every book I could find about the stars. I served 6 years in the British Armed Forces before a diplomat named Eleanor Cross spotted something in me she said was useful. She called it the ability to walk into a room full of enemies and make them feel like they had made the first mistake. I did not understand what she meant until I stood at the entrance of the Galactic Council chamber and felt 23 alien species pretend they had not just signed a document ordering the destruction of my home planet. The chamber is enormous. I will never stop being struck by how enormous it is. It rises 40 stories from floor to ceiling, carved from the mineral core of a captured asteroid, lit by a bioluminescent lattice that pulses faintly blue. The seats are arranged in a perfect ring at the center, descending in tiers like a great bowl. 47 species. 47 flags and banners and light symbols hanging from the upper walls. And at the very bottom, where all eyes inevitably fell, a single small desk that had been added to the arrangement 11 years ago when Earth was granted observer status. Not a vote, just a desk, a seat to sit in while the adults of the galaxy made decisions. I had sat at that desk for 3 years. I had watched motions pass and fail, treaties signed and broken, trade routes negotiated over the heads of worlds that would never know the difference. I had submitted 14 formal requests for a speaking slot and been denied 11 of them. The other 3 had been granted in moments of procedural generosity, and I had used each one carefully, quietly, building a record of a human who listened more than he spoke. They thought that made me harmless. I sat down at my small desk. The session had already been called to order by the chair, an Orathian named Velashar, whose 6 limbs were folded in the formal arrangement of an opened meeting. Velashar had always been almost kind to me, in the way that very powerful people are almost kind to someone they do not consider a threat. The Veil Ambassador, whose name translated roughly as first voice of the expansion, sat across the ring at the elevated delegation platform reserved for species with full council membership. The veil looked something like a heron crossed with a mantis, long, precise, extraordinarily still when they want to project authority. First voice was projecting enormous authority right now. I opened my document case. I placed 3 items on the desk: a printed copy of the motion that had been passed, which I had received through a source I was not going to name in this chamber, a small communication device, and a cup of tea in a sealed travel container, because I had learned in 3 years that these sessions ran long, and the replicated beverages the council provided tasted like warm metal. Velashar spoke the formal opening words in the common tongue, a language that had taken me 2 years to become fluent in. The motion before the council, now ratified by the required threshold, authorized a corrective orbital strike on the 3rd planet of the Sol system. The language was precise and bloodless. Corrective. As though Earth had developed a problem that simply required fixing. The strike was authorized under Article 17 of the Galactic Resource Covenant, which allowed senior council members to take action when a developing world's activities created interference with established commercial corridors. Our mining operations in the outer belt had been disrupting Veil cargo routes. That was it. That was the whole reason. Not aggression, not a threat, not a crime. Inconvenience. We had been inconvenient, and the solution that had been agreed upon by 23 species without a single conversation with Earth, without a single formal warning, without even the courtesy of a message, was to remove the source of the inconvenience. Remove, another precise, bloodless word. I let Velashar finish the formal reading. I let the chamber settle. I watched First Voice of the Expansion arrange their long neck into the angle that, among the veil, signals complete confidence. I had studied veil body language for 2 years. I knew every angle. Then I raised my hand. The room did not go quiet. It had already been quiet. What happened was something harder to describe, a change in the quality of the silence, as though the silence itself had noticed something. Velashar paused. The Orathian custom when an observer raises a hand is to acknowledge and then defer politely until the formal business of the session is complete. I had seen it done a dozen times. It was a graceful way of saying, "We see you, and we will get to you eventually." Velashar said, "The floor recognizes the human." Not my name, not my title, the human. I had never been given a formal title by the council because observers do not receive titles. But in 3 years I had noticed that Velashar always called me the human with something that was not quite dismissal. It was closer to curiosity. The kind of curiosity that keeps its distance, just in case. I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I did not perform. I had practiced this moment in my apartment for 9 of the 11 days that had passed since I first intercepted intelligence about the vote, and what I had practiced was this: be calm, be slower than they expect, make every word land like something that was already true before you said it. I said, I would like to formally inform this council that Earth has been aware of this vote for 11 days. The silence that followed was a different kind entirely. I watched it move around the chamber like a wave. I watched species that had been reviewing their data feeds look up. I watched First Voice of the Expansion go very still in the way a predator goes still, not relaxed still, but coiled still, the kind of stillness that is actually motion holding its breath. I let the silence sit for 5 seconds. I had counted those seconds in practice too. Then I said, I would like to walk this council through what humanity did with 11 days. Velashar's secondary eyelids, the inner pair, the ones that close when an Orathian is surprised, closed halfway. I had never seen Velashar surprised before. Nobody interrupted me. I began to speak. The first thing I told them was not about weapons or military movements or any of the things they were already recalibrating their assumptions around. The first thing I told them was about a vote. 6 billion people, I said, across every continent and every time zone on Earth, had been asked a single question through our global parliamentary network. The question was presented without drama and without recommendation. It read, Our planet has been targeted for a corrective strike by the Galactic Council. Your government requests your guidance on the appropriate response. 2 options were on the table. Option 1, initiate immediate defensive and retaliatory preparations. Option 2, prepare defenses and request a formal hearing before the Council first. 81% of Earth's population had chosen Option 2. I paused after I said that number. I watched it land. I watched several delegates look at each other in a way that species do when they are trying not to show that they have just recalculated something important. I said, we were not told what to be afraid of. We were not told who had voted against us. We were given the plain facts and asked what kind of people we wanted to be. And 81% of humans, given a choice between striking first and talking first, chose to talk first. I picked up my tea, I took a sip, I let them sit with that. First Voice of the Expansion had not moved. The angle of their neck had changed, though. It was no longer the angle of complete confidence. It was something I had only seen once before in a veiled delegate at a session involving a trade dispute with the Harathi Collective. It was the angle that meant, I have walked into a room I did not understand. Good, I thought, now we can begin. I set the cup down. I looked around the chamber, all those eyes, all those species. All that ancient institutional power arranged in a perfect ring around a small human at a small desk. And I said the sentence I had practiced most carefully of all. I said, "Let me tell you what humanity did with the other 10 days." And nobody in that chamber made a sound. The mistake, I told them, was not theirs alone. It would be dishonest of me to stand in that chamber and perform outrage, as though the Galactic Council had committed some extraordinary error of imagination. They had not. They had done exactly what every intelligent species does when it encounters a new civilization. They had looked at what we had done, and from that, they had concluded what we were capable of. The problem was that what humanity had done on the surface looked very manageable. We had fought wars, many of them, across centuries. The Council's xenological database had catalogued every major armed conflict in human recorded history. They had studied our wars with the clinical interest of a species watching another species' particularly unfortunate phase of development. They had noted the patterns: territorial conflict, ideological conflict, resource competition. They had noted the progression toward less frequent large-scale wars over the past 2 centuries. They had interpreted this as growth, maturity, the natural civilizational arc away from violence toward cooperation. They were not wrong about the arc. They were wrong about what was driving it. I told the chamber this plainly. I said, "You studied our history and you saw us becoming less violent. What you did not ask was why." The answer was not that humans had grown past our capacity for conflict. The answer was that we had grown very, very precise about when to use it, and extraordinarily prepared for when someone else started it. Peace, for humanity, had never meant the absence of readiness. It meant the presence of enough readiness that the calculation for any aggressor became unbearable. We called it deterrence. We had practiced it for generations. We had built entire philosophical, economic, and military frameworks around the idea that the best outcome was one where you never had to use what you had spent decades preparing. They had seen our peace. They had not seen what our peace was resting on. I let that settle before I continued. Day 1, I said. 11 days ago, 4 hours after my intelligence source confirmed the vote was moving toward ratification, the United Earth Defense Network received a single encrypted signal from the Global Coordination Center. It was not an emergency broadcast. It was not a public alert. It was a quiet, prearranged signal, the kind that had been built into the system 40 years ago and tested, quietly, every 2 years since. Every orbital defense platform across Earth's solar system came online simultaneously. I watched the Veil ambassador's secondary eyelids close. The full secondary eyelids this time. Among the Veil, that is an involuntary response. It means the body has received information that conflicts with a deeply held assumption. I continued without acknowledging it. These were not new platforms, I said. They were not hurried constructions assembled in a panic. They had existed for decades, placed at precise gravitational anchor points across the system, powered by independent reactors, maintained by rotating crews who had never been publicly identified as military personnel. To anyone observing our system from outside, they appeared to be research stations, navigation relay points, deep space communication hubs. They were not. Day 2, I said. Humanity has operated a deep space relay network for 60 years. This was known to the Council. You have records of it. You cataloged it as a primitive long-range communication infrastructure, an early-stage technology for a species still working out how to talk to its own outer colonies. This was not inaccurate. The network did serve that purpose. It also served another purpose, which had been built into it from the beginning and never mentioned in any document that the Galactic Council had access to. I paused here, not for drama, but because I wanted to give the delegates a moment to understand that they had been looking at something for 60 years without seeing it. On day 2, The secondary function of the relay network was activated for the first time outside of internal tests. I will not describe its full capabilities in this chamber, because some of what it does is still classified by Earth's government, and I was instructed to share only what was necessary to make the Council understand the situation they were in. What I will say is that by the end of Day 2, we had a complete real-time picture of every vessel within 4 light-years of Sol, including vessels that were using cloaking technology that the Council officially classifies as undetectable. The chamber shifted. I felt it rather than saw it, a collective physical adjustment, the kind that happens when a room full of people simultaneously revises a belief. The Harathi delegate, a species known for their extraordinary composure, made an audible sound. I did not look at them. I kept my eyes level, my voice even. Day 3, I said. 6,200,000,000 people live on Earth. On Day 3, following authorization from the Global Parliament, which had met in emergency session and voted on the matter publicly, in a broadcast that any species with the right frequency could have picked up, the process of moving Earth's population into reinforced subterranean shelters began. Not as a panicked evacuation, as a practice drill. The shelters had been built into the infrastructure of every major city on Earth over a period of 40 years. Not secretly, they were in the public record, listed as civil emergency infrastructure. The Council's intelligence files contained references to them. They had been categorized as disaster preparedness measures, extreme perhaps by galactic standards, but interpreted as consistent with humanity's documented anxiety about large-scale emergencies. They were disaster preparedness measures. We had simply been very honest about what kind of disaster we were preparing for. By the end of Day 3, 94% of Earth's urban population had completed shelter transition. The remaining 6% were in transit or managing essential surface operations. The process had been smooth because it had been rehearsed, quietly in components, for decades. Never all at once, never in a way that would look like preparation for exactly this scenario, but always in a way that meant when the real signal came, everyone knew what to do. I picked up my tea again. I took a sip. I was aware that every eye in the chamber was fixed on me. The Tharesi delegate, a species renowned for being the oldest spacefaring civilization currently active in the Council, who had been members for 3,000 years and had seen more conflicts than most civilizations had history, leaned forward in their seat for the first time in the session. I took that as a sign I was being heard. Day 4, I continued. Day 5, Day 6, I walked them through each one. Not quickly, I wanted every detail to arrive with room to breathe. On Day 4, our communication team had transmitted 6 diplomatic messages to various Council members through back channels we had quietly identified over 3 years of careful observation. None of those members were in this chamber today. That was intentional. We were not trying to start a backroom negotiation. We were creating a record, a documented trail of good faith outreach that existed before I walked into this room. On Day 5, Earth's global scientific network, which the Council had always considered our most impressive and least threatening institution, completed a data compilation that had been running continuously for 11 days. I would get to what that data contained in a moment. On Day 6, we held another public vote. This one was not about how to respond to the strike. It was about what terms Earth would accept for de-escalation. The Parliament presented 4 options, explained each one in plain language, and let 6 billion people choose. The winning option, with 67% of the vote, was this: seek full Council membership with voting rights, withdraw all defensive preparations in exchange, and offer the data compilation as a gesture of transparency. 67%, not unanimous, not performed. Genuine democratic disagreement, genuine deliberation, genuine choice. The Vale ambassador said something at this point. The first words First Voice had spoken since I began. The words, in the common tongue, were, You held a public vote about your military posture. I looked at them directly for the first time. I said, we hold public votes about everything. That is what we are. That is the part of humanity that every intelligence assessment you have ever run has listed as a structural weakness. I let that sit. Then I said, Day 7, and I watched the color change in the Veil ambassadors' facial plates, the pale shift that in their species means something has just become very real. Because Day 7 was the day we launched. 42 unmanned probes. Silent, fast, built over the previous decade in a program that had been funded as long-range astronomical survey vehicles. They had launched from 3 separate points in the outer system, on trajectories that had been calculated years before, stored in a sealed file that required a 3-part authorization from separate branches of Earth's government to open. They were not weapons. I want to be precise about this because precision matters here. They were not carrying any device capable of causing physical harm. They were, exactly as originally labeled, survey vehicles. What they were surveying was the Veil colonial system. By Day 7, they were already beyond the range of any detection system the Council had publicly disclosed. By the time I was standing in this chamber, they had been traveling for 4 days. They had mapped the gravitational architecture of 11 Veil colony worlds. They had cataloged the heat signatures of 17 Veil shipyards. They had identified 33 fuel depot locations from the resonance patterns of their shielding systems. They had done all of this passively, silently, from a range that made interception impossible. I said, by the end of the Council session today, we will know more about Veil colonial infrastructure than any external party has ever known. We will know it more precisely than most internal Veil surveys, because our instruments were designed by a species that spent 2 centuries mapping every rock in its own solar system just to understand what was there. The chamber had gone beyond quiet. It had gone into a state I had no word for in English, something between held breath and suspension. The way a moment feels when everyone in a room understands simultaneously that the situation they believe they were in is not the situation they are actually in. First voice of the expansion had their neck at an angle I had never seen before. I did not have a word for it in my notes. I would have to add a new entry. Velashar was looking at me with all 4 of their eyes, the 2 primary ones, and the secondary pair that face slightly backward, which Orathians only direct at something when they consider it genuinely significant. I said, I told you what 42 probes accomplished. I have not yet told you where the other assets are. I let that sentence exist in the room for a moment. Then I said, let us talk about what Earth would like to propose. Here is the thing about humans that no external observer has ever correctly accounted for, and I have thought about why that is for most of my adult life. We are not, at our core, a civilization that discovered war and is slowly growing past it. That framing is wrong in a way that sounds almost right, which is the most dangerous kind of wrong. It leads you to conclusions that feel logical, conclusions like, the humans are becoming more peaceful, which means the humans are becoming less dangerous. Watch for a few more generations and they will be genuinely manageable. What we actually are is this. We are a species that was forged by pressure. Not unusual pressure. Most species face competition for resources, face predators, face the violent randomness of a living planet. But our pressure was different in one particular way. We survived it with our minds, not our bodies. We are not the fastest, strongest, toughest, most durable biological entity that ever developed intelligence. We are, by the physical standards of the galaxy's major species, quite fragile. We have no natural armor. Our sensory range is limited. We sleep for 8 hours out of every 24, which is an extraordinary vulnerability for any creature that has ever faced predation. We get cold easily. We get hot easily. Our bones break. And yet here we are. The reason is not that we became peaceful. The reason is that we became extraordinarily good at turning every available resource into a tool, every available tool into a system, and every available system into a network that was harder to destroy than any individual part of it. We survived not by being hard to hurt, but by making it very expensive to keep hurting us. Every time something tried to eliminate us, drought, ice, disease, other humans, we adapted in a way that made us more resistant to the next attempt. That instinct did not leave us when we developed civilization. We just started applying it at larger scales. I said all of this to the council, not as a speech, as an explanation. There is a difference and it matters. A speech is performed. An explanation is given, and you give it because you believe the people in the room are capable of understanding it and you want them to. I believed that. I had always believed that. Eleanor Cross had told me, when she recruited me, that the most important quality she was looking for was someone who genuinely thought the galaxy could be reasoned with. She said she had met a lot of people who were willing to fight for Earth and very few who were willing to talk for it, and she needed the second kind because the first kind was already well covered. I was trying to talk for Earth right now. I said, your intelligence assessments of humanity have consistently listed 3 vulnerabilities that you believed made us a low-risk civilization to manage. 1. Internal division. 2. Short-term thinking. 3. Emotional decision-making. I paused. I said, I would like to address each of these directly. The internal division point was not wrong, I said. We disagree. Constantly, publicly, often loudly. We disagree about politics, about values, about the right way to do almost everything. This is not a weakness we are trying to overcome. It is a deliberate feature of how we organize ourselves, because we learned a very long time ago that the most dangerous condition for a human civilization is not disagreement. It is the absence of disagreement. Civilizations that stop arguing stop correcting themselves. They stop noticing when they have made a mistake. They become very confident and very fragile at the same time. Our divisions are the mechanism by which we stay calibrated. They are loud and often frustrating and sometimes genuinely damaging in the short term, and they are also the reason why no single error of judgment by any individual or group has ever permanently broken us. The vote on how to respond to the Council's strike passed through 412 separate legislative bodies before it was finalized. 412. Each one with the power to slow it, challenge it, send it back. Each one representing a different population, with different priorities and different fears. That is not chaos. That is a system specifically designed to make catastrophic mistakes very, very hard to make. I let that land. The short-term thinking point, I said, is the one I find most interesting because it is the most precisely incorrect. The data compilation I mentioned, the one completed on day 5 of our 11 days, was assembled from a continuous monitoring program that Earth's intelligence networks have been running for 60 years. 60 years of observation, cataloged, cross-referenced, updated. The probes that launched on day 7 were designed and built over the previous decade, based on propulsion research that began 20 years before that. The shelter infrastructure that received 6 billion people on day 3 was constructed over 40 years. The secondary relay network function that came online on day 2 was engineered into the system 60 years ago. I said we think in centuries, we simply do not announce it. The Orathian chair made a sound at this point. It was soft, a low harmonic that, in Orathian communication, functioned something like a sharp intake of breath. Velashar recovered immediately, but not before several delegates had glanced over. I said, and the third point, emotional decision-making. I said, yes, we make emotional decisions. We are emotional beings. We evolved that way and we have not apologized for it, and we do not intend to. What I would ask the Council to consider is whether emotion has been correctly analyzed as a liability in our decision-making, or whether it has been misread. Humans get angry. Yes, we also get frightened and grief-stricken and guilty and ashamed of ourselves, and those emotional states consistently produce behavior that has no logical survival benefit in the short term and enormous benefit in the long term. We rebuilt nations we had destroyed. We provided aid to populations we had previously fought. We developed laws specifically designed to protect individuals against the impulse of the group, even when the group's impulse was understandable. We do not make purely logical decisions. We make human decisions, and human decisions at their best are ones that account for the future cost of present choices in ways that pure logic, run by beings without memory of suffering, consistently misses. I picked up my tea. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway. The Veil ambassador, first voice of the expansion, had been silent through all of this. The silence of first voice was no longer the silence of authority. It was the silence of a being sitting in a room they had entered believing they were the largest presence in it. I said, I have told you what we did in 11 days. I have told you who we are. Now I would like to tell you what the 42 probes found. And I watched the chamber for the third time, change the quality of its silence. The probes were recalled 3 hours before I entered the chamber. I want to be specific about this because the specificity matters. I did not recall them during the session as a gesture of conciliation in response to the Council's reaction. I recalled them before I arrived, based on a decision made by Earth's Parliament 4 days earlier, before the session date was even confirmed. The recall signal had been sent. The probes were already turning back. By the time I sat down at my small desk and opened my document case, the 42 probes were no longer on an outward trajectory. I told the Council this clearly, and I told them exactly why. The Parliament's reasoning, as written in the motion that authorized the recall, was as follows. The purpose of the probes was demonstration, not deployment. We needed the Council to understand that we had the capability, the precision, and the reach to gather that information. We did not need to keep gathering it indefinitely, and we did not need to keep the Veil colonial system under surveillance as a bargaining tool. That would have been leverage, and leverage in the parliamentary debate had been specifically rejected as an approach. Leverage, one of the senior delegates had argued in the session I had watched from a streaming feed in my apartment, is how you win a negotiation. It is not how you build a relationship. And we need to decide right now whether we are trying to win today or whether we are trying to build something that lasts. The motion to recall the probes had passed, with 78% support. I read that number into the chamber record. I watched first voice of the expansion's facial plates shift through 3 different color states in roughly 4 seconds. Among the Veil, rapid color change in the facial plates is a sign of deep cognitive processing, the body responding to information that the mind is still working to integrate. The Thuresi delegate, who had not spoken in any session I had ever attended, spoke for the first time. They said, in a voice that was low and carried the particular resonance of a species that had been breathing a slightly different atmospheric composition for 3,000 years of spaceflight, Ambassador Morrow, your parliament debated the ethics of keeping surveillance on a civilization that had voted to destroy you and chose to stop the surveillance voluntarily. It was not quite a question. It was the kind of statement that functions as a question when the speaker cannot quite bring themselves to phrase it as one, because they are not sure they are ready for the answer. I said yes. The Thuresi delegate sat back. They did not say anything further for the rest of the session. I continued. The data the probes had already collected, 4 days of mapping before the recall signal reached them, was in our possession. It was not going anywhere. But the way that data was handled was also something I needed the Council to understand, because it was part of the proposal I was bringing on behalf of Earth. Earth was offering to share the compiled data with the Veil government directly. Not as a threat, not as an implicit reminder of what we were capable of gathering, as a transparency measure. The data we had collected on Vale colonial infrastructure represented a significant intelligence advantage, and rather than keep that advantage, the Parliament had voted to return it to its source. The Vale would receive everything our probes had mapped, every gravitational signature, every depot location, every shipyard reading, with the technical methodology attached, so they could assess exactly how we had gathered it and independently verify the accuracy. The chamber did not erupt into noise. What happened was more interesting, a kind of collective forward lean, multiple species shifting in their seats simultaneously, the physical expression of a group recalibrating. The Vale ambassador said very quietly, "Why?" Not angrily, not as a challenge, as a genuine question. The word came out in the common tongue with a texture I had never heard in a Vale voice before, something almost stripped of its usual precision, like a question that had bypassed all the filters. I said, "Because we want a seat at this table, not as a condition of not using what we know, as a condition of the kind of relationship we want to have with every species in this chamber. Transparency works both ways. We are showing you ours. We are asking for the kind of standing that allows us to be part of every decision that affects us, so that what happened 11 days ago never has to happen again." I stood up properly then, for the first time since I had started speaking. Not for drama. My back had begun to ache, and the medical officer who had approved my credentials 2 years ago had told me I needed to stop sitting in that particular chair for extended periods. But it also felt right to be standing when I said the next part. I said, "Earth is requesting a full voting seat on the Galactic Council, not observer status, not advisory standing, a vote. One vote equal in weight to every other vote in this chamber, including the vote of species that have been members for 3,000 years. I said, in exchange for that seat, Earth will formally withdraw all defensive military posture to pre-incident levels, share the complete probe data with the Vale government, and submit to a full transparency audit of any Earth program that any council member believes represents a security concern, conducted by an independent panel that Earth does not appoint and does not supervise." I said, "We are not asking to be trusted. We are offering to be verified. There is a difference." I sat back down. First voice of the expansion had been still for so long that several delegates had glanced at the Vale platform to confirm that the ambassador was still conscious. The long neck was at an angle I had noted in my observation files under the category unclassified. It was an angle I had never documented before. If I had to describe it in terms of human body language, I would say it looked like a person who had walked into a building expecting it to be small, and found that it went on in every direction without visible walls. Velashar said, "This council will recess for deliberation." I said, "Of course. I would like to note for the record that I will be in the antechamber if any delegate wishes to speak informally before the formal deliberation concludes." Velashar said, "So noted." I gathered my documents. I capped my empty tea container. I walked out of the chamber without looking at the Vale delegation, because I had been advised by Eleanor Cross, years ago, that the most effective exit is always one where you do not check to see if anyone is watching you leave. They were all watching me leave. I had learned to be fine with that. The antechamber is a plain room. This always surprises visitors. The council chamber is staggering in its architecture, and the room immediately outside it is 4 white walls, a low table, and a set of chairs that were clearly designed for Orathian proportions and are uncomfortable for every other species. There is a wall panel that provides beverages, and as I have noted, the beverages are not good. I made myself a cup of whatever the machine classified as tea, found it tasted like warm mineral water with ambition, and sat down in the least uncomfortable chair to wait. I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. She always answers on the second ring, because she says answering on the first ring makes you look like you have nothing better to do, and answering after the third means someone starts to worry. She said, "How did it go?" I said, "I think all right. We are waiting for the vote." She said, "Are you eating? You look thin in the last photos you sent." I told her I was eating. I was not entirely sure this was true. The 11 days had involved a lot of working through meal times. She said, "Your grandmother called. She wanted to know if you had used the thing she told you about." My grandmother's advice, delivered the evening before I left for the council station, had been this: when you are in a room full of powerful people and you need them to listen, do not try to be impressive. Just be quieter than they expect. Powerful people are not used to quiet. It unsettles them more than shouting. I told my mother I had, and that it seemed to have worked. She said, "Good, that woman knows things." We talked for a while, not about the council, not about the session. She told me the weather had been difficult at home, and that our neighbor's dog had learned to open the gate and had been visiting unannounced, and that my younger brother had finally passed his engineering qualification and was insufferably pleased with himself about it. I listened. I drank my bad tea. I let the information about ordinary life settle over me like something familiar and solid, because there is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from performing competence in front of 47 species for several hours, and the antidote to it is not rest. It is reality. The door opened 40 minutes into my wait. It was not a council official, it was Velashar. The Orathian chair coming to the antechamber personally was, as far as I was aware, unprecedented. I stood. My mother said, "Who is it?" and I said, "I will call you back." She said, "All right, but eat something." I promised I would. Velashar stood in the doorway for a moment in a way that I had learned to read as the Orathian equivalent of composing themselves before speaking. Then they entered and let the door close behind them. Velashar said, "The Vale delegation has requested to abstain from the vote." I said, "I see." Velashar said, "They cited conflict of circumstance. First Voice of the Expansion has also requested to make a brief statement to the full chamber before the vote is taken. It will not affect the outcome. The chair has assessed the preliminary positions." I said, "And the preliminary positions suggest." Velashar's 4 eyes arranged themselves in the pattern that meant direct engagement. The primary and secondary pairs all oriented at the same subject simultaneously. Velashar said, "Ambassador Morrow, I have sat in this chamber for 19 years. I have watched 43 species receive full council membership. In every case, the membership was granted because the applying species had met a threshold of development, of technology, of demonstrated stability." Velashar paused. Velashar said, "I have never before watched a species receive membership because the chamber was afraid of what would happen if they did not extend the invitation. I want you to understand that I am saying this as an observation, not as a criticism." I considered this for a moment. Then I said, "With respect, Chair, I think the chamber should not be afraid of us. I think the chamber should understand us. Those are different things, and which one we end up with depends on what kind of relationship we build from here." Velashar said, "Is that what today was, an introduction?" I said, "I hope so. The other version of today would have looked very different, and 6 billion people voted specifically to make sure it did not." Velashar was quiet. The secondary eyelids did not close this time. The Orathian face, I had come to understand, was most readable in stillness, and what Velashar's stillness said right now was something I did not have a word for in any language I spoke, but that felt, in a way I could not entirely explain, like the beginning of something. Velashar said, "The vote will be called in 20 minutes. The chair would be grateful if the Earth representative would be present." I said I would be there. Velashar turned to leave. At the door they paused, and this was new, this pause, this unorathian hesitation, and said, without turning back, "Ambassador, what your grandmother told you, it was good advice." I had not mentioned my grandmother in the chamber. I had not mentioned the call. I said, "How did you?" Velashar said, "The antechamber is not monitored. The corridor outside it is." And left. I stood there for a moment in the plain room with the uncomfortable chairs and the bad tea, and I thought about what Alina Cross had told me when she recruited me. She had said that humanity's greatest underestimated quality was not our technology or our military readiness or our capacity for organized resistance. She had said it was something simpler and harder to quantify. She had said, "We surprise people, not because we are unpredictable, but because people always assume they have finished learning what we are capable of, and we never let them be right about that." I straightened my jacket. I picked up my document case. I finished the last of the bad tea and left the cup on the table. I walked back into the chamber. The vote took 3 hours. 3 hours of formal deliberation, procedural motions, recorded statements from delegates who wanted their positions documented for their home governments. I sat at my small desk and listened to species with names I had spent 3 years learning to pronounce correctly make arguments for and against and around, and beside the question of whether humanity deserved a chair at the table they had been sitting beside for a decade. Some of the arguments were generous. The Haladry Collective argued that Earth's response to the strike authorization had demonstrated exactly the kind of restraint and multi-layered institutional decision-making that the Council valued. The Thoresi delegate made a second appearance on record, brief, characteristically precise, and said that a civilization which voluntarily abandoned a significant intelligence advantage as a diplomatic gesture had demonstrated a sophistication of strategic thinking that the Council would be unwise to keep outside the room. Some of the arguments were cautious. The Melari Federation asked for assurances about the secondary relay network's capabilities. The Preth Alliance wanted the transparency audit timeline accelerated. 2 smaller species whose names translated roughly as the careful ones asked whether the vote could be deferred for a standard galactic year to allow for further assessment. The vote was not deferred. 44 in favor, 3 abstentions. The Vale delegation did not vote. Velashar announced the result in the formal language of the Council, and then said a sentence in the common tongue that was not part of any formal script. Velashar said, "Earth is welcome to this table. We hope to learn a great deal from each other." I said, "So do we." The chamber did not break into celebration. It was not that kind of room. What happened was more measured and more genuine, a gradual shift in posture across the ring, the physical expression of a group that had arrived at a moment it would take some time to fully understand. First Voice of the Expansion made their statement before leaving. I had been told it was coming but not what it would say, and so I sat and listened as the Vale ambassador addressed the chamber in formal Vale, translated in real time by the Council's language system into a voice that came through my earpiece with the particular flatness of machine translation. First Voice said, "The Expansion apologizes to the people of Earth for the motion brought before this Council 11 days ago. It was brought without adequate consideration of the full situation. The Expansion acknowledges that this was an error and commits to a formal review of the decision process that led to the motion being filed. The Expansion looks forward to building a new relationship with Earth as a full Council member." It was a precise, measured, institutional apology. It was not warm. It was not personal. It was exactly what a formal body offers when it recognizes it has made a significant mistake and wants the record to reflect that it knows this. I accepted it on behalf of Earth with a single nod. No speech. No extended response. Alina Cross had always said that the best response to a hard-won apology is to let it stand on its own without burying it in words. The session closed. The delegates began to move. I sat at my desk for a moment after the formal adjournment. Not for any particular reason. I just sat and let the room exist around me, the vast carved chamber, the 47 banners on the upper walls, the bioluminescent light pooling its quiet blue above everything. I thought about how many decisions had been made in this room over the centuries. How many species had sat in these seats and argued about the shape of the galaxy's future. How many of those arguments had happened without a single human voice in the room. Not anymore. A delegate stopped beside my desk on their way out. The Harathi representative, a species that looks something like a small tree that has decided to take up walking. The Harathi had been the first species to publicly support the observer seat 11 years ago, in a debate I had read in archived transcripts before I was ever posted here. The Harathi representative said, in a voice like wind moving through dry branches, "Ambassador, a question. Your parliament voted 81% to seek dialogue rather than respond with immediate defensive action. This is after learning you were targeted for destruction without warning or negotiation. This is a remarkable number." I said, yes. The Harathi said, the 19%, what did they vote for? I said, for immediate response, for taking what we had built and using it before being asked to talk. The Harathi said, and you are not concerned that 19% of your population believes that was the right choice. I thought about this. I thought about the specific people I knew who had probably been among that 19%, my old commanding officer, who had sent me a message before the session that said simply, whatever you say in there, make sure they understand we are not afraid. I thought about my grandmother who had survived a war and who had said nothing when I told her what I was going to do, just looked at me for a long moment and then said, be steady. I said, 19% represents over 1 billion people who thought we should lead with strength. That is not a problem. That is a reminder. It is a reminder to the Council and to ourselves that the 81% is not inevitable. It is a choice that has to be made again every time. And I think that is actually more meaningful than if the number had been 100%. 100% agreement means something has gone wrong. 81% means the remaining 19 are still in the room, still part of the conversation, still counted. The Harathi representative stood for a moment in the particular way that trees stand, completely still and somehow not quite static. Then they said, I think you will do well here, and walked away. I gathered my things for the last time and left the chamber. The corridor outside smelled faintly of the recycled atmosphere that all enclosed spaces on the council station used, not unpleasant, just not quite right, like air that had been thought about too carefully. I walked through it with my document case and my empty tea container and the small dataset chip in my jacket pocket that contained the complete probe survey, ready to be transmitted to the Vale government's secure channel before the end of the station day.